Beneath the relentless sun of the American Southwest, where civilization fades into endless horizons of sand and rock, a man runs from his demons. Jack Morrison, a weathered cowboy with eyes that have seen too much, buys a forgotten cabin in the heart of the desert, a place so remote that even the wind seems to whisper warnings to stay away. He seeks what he believes the wilderness can offer: silence, solitude, and perhaps redemption from a past stained with regret. But the desert keeps its own secrets, and some discoveries change everything. When Jack encounters a wild boy living among nomadic strangers, speaking a language lost to time, he realizes his escape has led him not to isolation, but to a mystery that will challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, humanity, and the thin line between civilization and the wild. What begins as a quest for peace becomes a journey into the unknown, where the greatest dangers aren't the scorpions or the heat, but the truths waiting to be unearthed beneath the burning sky. The truck coughed and sputtered as it climbed the final ridge, sending a plume of dust into the copper afternoon sky. Jack Morrison gripped the steering wheel with calloused hands, his knuckles white against the cracked leather. Behind him, everything he owned filled 3 boxes in the truck bed, a life condensed into photographs, a few books, and clothes worn thin by years of hard living. Ahead, rising from the desert floor like a defiant monument to stubbornness, stood the cabin. It was smaller than the photographs had suggested, its weathered wood bleached gray by decades of sun, its tin roof rusted orange at the edges. But it was his, and more importantly, it was alone. No neighbors for 30 miles. No roads except the dirt path his truck had barely managed. No sounds except the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. This was what Jack had paid for, not luxury, not comfort, but distance. Distance from the noise of Phoenix, from the hollow conversations in crowded bars, from the memories that haunted him in the small hours of morning. Distance from himself, if such a thing were possible. He climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching on the hard-packed sand, and surveyed his new domain. The landscape stretched in every direction, an ocean of beige and amber dotted with sagebrush and the skeletal remains of ancient Joshua trees. Mountains rose in the far distance, purple shadows against the horizon. The silence was so complete, it seemed to have weight, pressing against his ears like invisible hands. Jack had grown up on a ranch in Montana, knew the language of open spaces, but this was different. This wasn't the fertile emptiness of grasslands. This was hostile territory, a place that suffered human presence rather than welcomed it. The desert demanded respect, required vigilance, and punished mistakes without mercy. It was exactly what he needed. The cabin's interior smelled of dust and time. A single room with a pot-bellied stove in one corner, a narrow bed frame with no mattress, shelves lined with mouse droppings, and a table that wobbled when he touched it. 2 windows faced east and west, their glass miraculously intact despite the cabin's obvious abandonment. Jack set down his first box and looked around with something approaching satisfaction. He'd brought supplies enough canned food for 3 months. Water purification tablets, tools, books he'd been meaning to read for years. He had a solar panel for basic electricity, a satellite phone for emergencies he didn't plan to have. The previous owner, a man named Dutch, who'd sold the property through a lawyer after moving to assisted living, had left behind a few items: a cast iron skillet, a coffee pot with a broken handle, and a journal with blank pages. Jack picked up the journal, felt its weight in his hands, then set it back down. He wasn't here to write his story. He was here to forget it. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Jack stood outside and watched the transformation. This was the desert's magic hour, when the brutal heat relented and the landscape revealed its hidden beauty. Shadows lengthened, colors deepened, and for a moment, everything seemed possible again. He thought of his ex-wife Sarah, who left him 3 years ago after he came home from Afghanistan, different than when he left. He thought of his daughter Emma, who was 12 now and called him less and less. He thought of the ranch foreman job he'd walked away from last month after punching his boss in a disagreement that seemed trivial now. All those threads that had once woven his life into something coherent had unraveled, leaving him here at the edge of nowhere, starting over. Or ending. He wasn't entirely sure which. That night, Jack lay on his sleeping bag atop the bare bed frame and stared at the ceiling beams. The darkness here was absolute, unpolluted by city lights or even the glow of a distant farmhouse. He could see stars through the western window, thousands of them, a river of light across the black dome of sky. He'd forgotten stars could look like this. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice carrying across the emptiness like a question without an answer. Jack closed his eyes and waited for sleep, but his mind remained stubbornly alert, cataloging the unfamiliar sounds. The creak of settling wood, the scratch of something small moving across the roof, the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, pulling him down into dreams of dust and distant voices. He woke at dawn to find the desert transformed again. Morning light turned everything silver and blue, cool and almost gentle. Jack made coffee on the camping stove he'd set up outside, watching steam rise from the battered pot as the sun climbed higher. He'd planned his first day carefully, unpacked completely, inventory supplies, repaired the worst of the cabin's damage, established routines. Structure would help. Purpose would help. He was halfway through reinforcing the doorframe when he saw them tracks in the sand near the cabin's south side. Not animal tracks. Human. Bare feet, small, moving in an erratic pattern that suggested either confusion or play. Jack knelt beside them, his soldier's training resurfacing as he studied the impressions. Fresh, probably from last night or early morning. The stride was short a child's feet, he guessed, no more than 10 or 11 years old. But what would a child be doing out here, alone, in the middle of the desert? The nearest town was 30 miles away. The nearest house, according to Dutch's map, was even farther. Jack stood and followed the tracks, his coffee forgotten, as they led away from the cabin toward a cluster of rocks and scrub. 20 yards out, they simply disappeared, as if the child had been lifted into the air or had learned to walk without leaving traces. An uneasy feeling settled in Jack's gut. He was not alone after all. Jack spent the morning trying to convince himself the tracks meant nothing, a hiker passing through, perhaps, or his eyes playing tricks in the unfamiliar landscape. But he tracked deer through Montana snow and insurgents through Afghan mountains. He knew human sign when he saw it. Someone had been near his cabin, someone small and barefoot, and apparently unconcerned about the dangers of wandering the desert at night. By afternoon, with the sun beating down like a hammer on an anvil, Jack's curiosity had metastasized into concern. He loaded a backpack with water, a first aid kit, and his old service pistol, not because he expected trouble, but because the desert demanded preparation. Then he set out in the direction the tracks had indicated before vanishing. The terrain grew rougher as he moved away from the cabin, sand giving way to broken rock and ravines carved by flash floods that came perhaps once a decade. Jack moved carefully, aware that a twisted ankle out here could be a death sentence. He'd walked nearly an hour when he saw it smoke, thin and gray, rising from behind a formation of red sandstone. Not a wildfire. Too controlled. Too deliberate. A campfire. His pulse quickened as he approached, every instinct telling him to be cautious. The rocks formed a natural amphitheater, hiding whatever lay within from casual view. Jack climbed to a vantage point and looked down. What he saw stopped him cold. Below, in a small depression sheltered from the wind, sat a camp unlike anything he'd expected. 3 tents made of patched canvas and animal hides formed a loose triangle around a central fire. Goats grazed nearby, bells tinkling softly around their necks. Bundles of supplies hung from makeshift frames, dried meat, water skins, rolled blankets. And moving among it all were figures dressed in layers of faded cloth and leather, their faces weathered and dark, speaking in a language Jack didn't recognize. Nomads, here in the 21st century American desert, living as if the modern world had never touched them. But it was the boy who captured Jack's attention. He appeared to be 9 or 10, thin as a willow switch, with tangled black hair and skin bronzed by constant sun exposure. He wore loose pants and nothing else, his chest bare and his feet calloused from walking on stones. He moved with an animal's grace, crouching by the fire to turn something cooking there, then sprinting to chase one of the goats that had wandered too far. The nomads barely glanced at him, as if a half-naked child was the most natural thing in the world. Jack watched for 20 minutes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The nomads, they counted 4 adults, 3 men and 1 woman, appeared to be preparing for travel. They moved with the efficiency of people who'd performed these tasks 1,000 times, rolling tents, packing supplies onto the goats' backs, covering the fire with sand. The boy helped with the easy tasks, but was clearly not expected to do heavy work. One of the men ruffled his hair as he passed, and the boy grinned up at him with obvious affection. They were family, Jack realized, or something like it. But where were they going? And where had they come from? This area was federal land, mostly, with scattered patches of private property, like his own cabin. There were no roads suitable for regular travel, no water sources reliable enough to support permanent settlement. These people were living like their ancestors might have a century ago, invisible to satellites and census takers alike. He was so absorbed in observation that he didn't notice when the boy looked up and saw him. Their eyes met across the distance. Jack's pale blue and startled, the boy's dark brown and curious. For a moment, neither moved. Then the boy did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a fearful smile or a threatening one, but the uncomplicated expression of a child seeing something interesting. He pointed at Jack and called out something in that strange language. The adult's head snapped up immediately. One of the men, tall and angular with gray threading his black beard, grabbed a long staff and started climbing toward Jack's position with surprising speed. The woman shouted something that sounded like a warning. Jack's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol, then stopped. He wasn't here to threaten anyone. Slowly he stood and raised both hands, palms out, hoping the gesture of peace translated across cultures. The bearded man reached him in less than a minute, staff raised and eyes hard with suspicion. Up close, Jack could see the deep lines in his face, the scars on his arms, the way he moved like someone accustomed to both violence and survival. They stared at each other, 2 men separated by language and experience, but united by the fundamental human need to protect what was theirs. Jack spoke slowly, keeping his voice calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just bought the cabin over that ridge. I saw tracks and got curious. That's all." The man's expression didn't change. He clearly hadn't understood a word. He gestured with the staff, a sharp motion that clearly meant leave. Jack nodded, started to turn away. Then the boy appeared, scrambling up the rocks with the fearlessness of youth. He planted himself between the 2 men and spoke rapidly, gesturing at Jack and then at the distant cabin. The bearded man's scowl deepened, but he lowered his staff slightly. An argument ensued, the man's voice low and stern, the boy's animated and insistent. Finally, the man made a dismissive gesture and turned away, climbing back down toward the camp. The boy stayed behind, studying Jack with frank curiosity. This close, Jack could see that his eyes were unusual, one brown, one flecked with green, a condition called heterochromia. His face was smudged with dirt, but his teeth were surprisingly white when he smiled again. He pointed at Jack and said something that sounded like a question. Jack shrugged helplessly. "I don't understand." The boy seemed to consider this, then pointed at himself. "Kale," he said clearly. Then he pointed at Jack, eyebrows raised. "Jack." Jack replied, feeling absurdly formal. Jack Morrison. Cale repeated the name, mangling the pronunciation but clearly pleased with himself. Then he pointed back toward the camp and made a sweeping gesture with his arm. They were leaving. Jack understood. Moving on to wherever nomads went. Cale reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A stone, smooth and black, probably from a riverbed hundreds of miles away. He held it out to Jack like a gift or a token. Jack hesitated, then accepted it, the stone warm from the boy's body heat. "Thank you," he said quietly. Cale grinned once more, then turned and scrambled back down the rocks, disappearing into the camp below. Within an hour, the nomads had vanished into the desert as completely as smoke and wind, leaving only ashes and footprints behind. Jack walked back to his cabin as evening approached, the black stone heavy in his pocket. He tried to tell himself that what he witnessed was simply unusual, not impossible. There were communities scattered throughout the Southwest that lived outside mainstream society, religious groups, survivalists, indigenous peoples maintaining traditional ways. Perhaps these nomads were something similar. Perhaps Cale was simply a child growing up in an unconventional, but ultimately harmless environment. But something nagged at him. The boy's eyes had held a brightness, an intelligence that seemed at odds with his primitive circumstances. And the way the bearded man had looked at Jack, not just with suspicion, but with something deeper. Fear? Protectiveness? Or the wariness of someone guarding a secret? That night, Jack lay awake again, the black stone on the table beside his bed, catching starlight through the window. He thought about Emma, wondered if she was happy, if her new stepfather was kind to her. He thought about all the children in the world growing up in strange circumstances, and whether Cale was truly content in his nomadic life or dreamed of something different. The desert wind picked up, rattling the tin roof, and somewhere in the darkness, Jack heard what might have been a childish laughter or might have been just another trick of the lonely night. Days became weeks, and Jack fell into the rhythm he'd sought. Rise at dawn, work on the cabin, read in the afternoon heat, watch sunsets that turned the sky into art. The isolation that had seemed daunting at first became comfortable, then necessary. He stopped checking his satellite phone, except once a week. He let his beard grow. He learned which plants were edible and which would make him sick, where rattlesnakes sunned themselves and where scorpions hid from the midday heat. The desert was revealing its nature to him slowly, like a suspicious animal deciding whether to trust. But he couldn't stop thinking about Cale. The boy appeared in his dreams, running through sand that turned to water, calling out in that incomprehensible language. Jack told himself it was normal to be curious, that seeing a child in such circumstances would affect anyone. Yet he found himself scanning the horizons each morning, looking for smoke or movement, hoping and fearing in equal measure that he'd see the nomads again. On the 23rd day after arriving at the cabin, Jack's wish was granted, though not in the way he'd expected. He woke before dawn to a sound that didn't belong. Voices, urgent and frightened, speaking that same strange language he'd heard before. He grabbed his pants and pistol and rushed outside to find chaos. Two of the nomad men were at his door, their faces desperate in the pre-dawn darkness. Behind them, visible in the growing light, was the woman, holding something in her arms. Know someone. Cale, limp and pale, his breathing shallow and labored. The bearded man saw Jack and spoke rapidly, the words meaningless, but the tone unmistakable. "Help us." Jack's combat medical training kicked in immediately. "Inside now," he ordered, gesturing when they hesitated. They carried the boy in and laid him on Jack's sleeping bag. In the light of Jack's battery-powered lantern, the situation became horrifyingly clear. Cale's left leg was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin discolored purple and black. 2 puncture wounds marked his ankle, a snake bite, probably from a diamondback rattlesnake, one of the deadliest in North America. Jack's mind raced through options. The bite was at least 6 hours old, judging by the swelling's extent. Anti-venom needed to be administered quickly, preferably within 4 hours. They were well past that window. The nearest hospital was 90 miles away, accessible only by helicopter, which would take at least an hour to arrive if he could even get a signal to call for one. Cale's pulse was rapid and weak, his breathing shallow. He was going into shock. Without intervention, he'd be dead within hours. Jack looked at the nomads' faces. The bearded man's jaw clenched so tight it trembled, the woman's eyes wet with tears. She refused to let fall the third man standing by the door, as if he wanted to run, but couldn't abandon the boy. "Satellite phone," Jack said, pointing at his backpack. "Hospital. Helicopter." The bearded man grabbed Jack's arm with surprising strength and spoke a single word that sounded like no. Then he pointed at Cale. "At the cabin. At Jack. Stay here. Save him here." Jack almost laughed at the impossibility. "I can't. He needs a hospital, real doctors, anti-venom." "I can't." But even as he protested, he was moving, pulling out his field medical kit, the one he'd carried through 2 tours in Afghanistan. He'd treated gunshot wounds in the dark, had kept men alive through helicopter evacuations across hostile territory. Could he save a dying boy from snakebite with limited supplies in a desert cabin? He didn't know. But he had to try. The next hours blurred into a desperate battle against poison and time. Jack elevated Cale's leg, applied a loose bandage above the bite to slow venom spread, started and forced saline drip from his medical kit to combat the shock. He cleaned the wound, applied what little anti-inflammatory medicine he had, and used ice from his cooler to reduce swelling. The nomads watched every move with terrified attention. The woman, Cale's mother, Jack, assumed, knelt beside the boy and sang softly, a melody that sounded ancient and sad. The bearded man paced like a caged animal. The third man disappeared and returned with bundles of desert plants Jack didn't recognize. Through gestures, he indicated they should be boiled and the liquid given to Cale to drink. Jack had no idea if the plants were medicinal or merely traditional hope, but he was in no position to refuse potential help. He boiled them and carefully spooned the bitter-smelling liquid into Cale's mouth, drop by drop. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out in pain, sometimes lying so still that Jack had to check his pulse to confirm he was still alive. Jack monitored his vital signs obsessively: pulse, breathing, temperature, pupil dilation. The venom was affecting Cale's nervous system, causing muscle spasms and periods where his breathing became dangerously slow. Each time, Jack would stimulate him, keep him engaged, force his body to keep fighting. He talked to the boy constantly, even though Cale couldn't understand him. "Come on, kid. You're tougher than this. Think about running in the desert tomorrow. Think about your goats. Think about whatever makes you happy." The woman heard the tone if not the words, and she smiled through her tears, nodding approval. As the sun climbed higher and the cabin grew hot, despite Jack's best efforts to keep it cool, something shifted. Cale's breathing steadied. His pulse, while still elevated, became more regular. The swelling in his legs stopped expanding. He wasn't getting better yet. The venom would take days to fully work through his system. But these stopped getting worse. He'd reached the crisis point and crossed it, still breathing, still alive. By noon, Jack was exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee. The nomads seemed to sense the change in Cale's condition. The terrible tension that had gripped them eased slightly. The bearded man approached Jack and placed both hands on his shoulders, speaking words that needed no translation. "Thank you." The woman touched Jack's face gently, a gesture so maternal and grateful that Jack felt his throat tighten. They stayed through the afternoon, taking turns watching over Cale, bringing Jack food he was too tired to refuse: dried meat and some kind of bread that tasted of smoke and honey. As evening approached and Cale slept more peacefully, The third man went outside and returned with the bearded man's staff. He held it out to Jack. In that culture, whatever it was, this clearly meant something significant. The bearded man nodded solemnly, indicating Jack should take it. Jack accepted the staff, feeling its weight, understanding it was more than wood. It was trust, gratitude, a bond formed in crisis. That night, with Cale's condition stable enough that sleep was possible, Jack sat outside under the stars with the bearded man. They couldn't speak each other's languages, but they shared water and silence, and somehow that was enough. The man drew in the sand with a stick simple pictures that told a story. A group of people traveling, mountains, a child born under stars. More travel, always moving, never stopping. Then he pointed at Cale sleeping inside and drew a symbol Jack didn't recognize, but which felt important. A prophecy? A destiny? The man's face was serious, almost fearful. Then he drew another symbol, a place, maybe, or a person, and made a gesture of searching. He pointed at Jack at the cabin, then swept his arm across the whole desert. You're part of this now, the gesture seemed to say. Whether you wanted to be or not, you're part of our story. Jack wanted to ask 100 questions, but the language barrier was absolute. Instead, he nodded, accepting what he didn't fully understand. The bearded man gripped his shoulder once more, then went inside to sleep near the boy who'd brought their worlds together. Jack sat alone with the stars and the staff and the growing certainty that his escape to the desert had been anything but an escape. He'd been running from his past, but perhaps the desert had been waiting for him all along, preparing him for exactly this moment, this boy, this impossible responsibility that had wandered into his life on bare feet and stolen his peace forever. Cale recovered slowly, spending nearly 2 weeks in Jack's cabin as the venom worked its way from his system. The swelling receded, the discoloration faded, and gradually the boy's brightness returned. The nomads stayed nearby, setting up their camp within sight of the cabin, a silent acknowledgement that something had changed between them and the solitary cowboy. During those weeks, Jack learned fragments of their language words: water, food, danger, thank you. The nomads, in turn, learned bits of English, enough for basic communication. The bearded man's name was Rashid, though Jack suspected it was a name adopted for ease rather than his true one. The woman was Cale's mother, Zara, and the third man, younger and quicker to smile, was called Tark. They were, Jack gradually understood, the remnants of a much larger group, wanderers by choice and tradition, carrying customs that predated the nations currently drawn on maps. Cale himself proved remarkably resilient, both physically and in spirit. As his strength returned, his curiosity about Jack and the cabin grew boundless. He wanted to touch everything, understand everything, know how every object worked. The solar panel fascinated him. He'd crouch in front of it for hours, watching how the angle of sun affected the power gauge. Jack's books were treasures beyond measure. Cale couldn't read English, but he studied the pictures with intense concentration, pointing at images and waiting for Jack to name them. Lion, airplane, city, ocean. Each word was repeated carefully, stored away in a mind that seemed to absorb information like desert sand absorbed rain. Slowly, haltingly, they began to communicate. Cale taught Jack words in his language that had no English equivalent concepts tied to navigation by stars, to reading weather and the behavior of insects, to understanding water by the way sand felt underfoot. Jack taught Cale about electricity, about machines, about the modern world that existed beyond the desert's edge. It was an exchange of worlds, two different ways of being human meeting in a tin-roof cabin surrounded by endless sand. But as Cale healed, Jack noticed something troubling. Rashid and Zara watched their son with increasing anxiety, speaking in low voices when they thought Jack couldn't hear, making gestures that suggested argument or difficult decision. One evening, after Cale had fallen asleep on Jack's repaired bed, Rashid invited Jack to their camp. Around the fire, with Tarek translating haltingly, they told Jack their story, or at least the parts they were willing to share. They were Bedouin, or something like Bedouin, descendants of travelers who'd crossed from the old world centuries ago and never stopped moving. Their ancestors had wandered the Sahara, the Arabian deserts, the vast emptiness of Central Asia. Some had eventually crossed the ocean and found the American Southwest, where the landscape reminded them of home. Here they'd continued their ways, invisible to settled people, moving with seasons and storms, living by ancient codes. Kale was special among them, Rashid explained through Tarek's careful translation. Born during a rare desert rain, marked by his unusual eyes, predicted by their eldest now dead, to be something more than ordinary. A bridge between worlds, the old woman had said. A child who would walk in two places at once. The prophecy was why they'd brought him into the desert so young. Rashid said, why they'd raised him traditionally, despite the modern world pressing in from all sides. They believed the old ways would protect him, prepare him for whatever destiny awaited. But nearly losing him to the snakebite had shaken their certainty. Zara, through tears and fractured English she'd been practicing, asked Jack a question that landed like a stone in his chest. Should he know? Other world? Your world? Jack had no answer. What could he say? That the modern world was better. He'd fled that world himself, found it hollow and harsh. That traditional life was superior? These people were strong and connected to the earth in ways he envied, but their existence was precarious, one drought or injury away from disaster. Both worlds had beauty. Both had cruelty. Cale deserved the chance to choose for himself, but how could a 9-year-old make such a choice? And was it even Jack's place to influence that decision? The question hung over them all through the following days. Cale, oblivious to the adult's turmoil, continued his recovery and education with equal enthusiasm. He began helping Jack with chores, learning to use tools, to read the simple words on canned food labels, to operate the hand-crank radio Jack used for weather reports. The boy's mind was extraordinary. He grasped concepts quickly, made connections between disparate ideas, asked questions that showed genuine understanding rather than mere curiosity. One afternoon, while they were repairing the cabin's roof together, Cale pointed toward the distant highway barely visible as a dark line on the horizon and asked Jack what lay beyond. Jack tried to explain cities, millions of people living in buildings that touched the sky, cars and computers, and schools and hospitals. Cale listened with wide eyes, then asked a question in careful English. People happy there? The simplicity of it cut through Jack. Were people happy there? He thought of Sarah, of Emma, of himself before he'd come to the desert. Some are, he said finally. Some aren't, just like everywhere. Cale considered this and nodded, apparently satisfied. But that night, lying in the darkness while Cale slept nearby, Jack faced the truth he'd been avoiding. The boy was becoming attached to him. And worse or perhaps better, he couldn't decide he was becoming attached to Cale. The child's laughter had become the best part of his days. Teaching him, watching his face light up with understanding, felt more meaningful than anything Jack had done in years. He was beginning to feel like a father again, filling a hole he'd thought permanently carved into his heart. Yet Cale had a family. Zara loved her son fiercely. Rashid was trying, in his stern way, to raise the boy right. Jack was just a stranger who'd happened to be in the right place when crisis struck. He had no claim on Cale, no right to influence his future. But if the nomads asked him directly, if they truly wanted his opinion on whether Cale should be exposed to modern life, what would he say? The question tormented him because he realized his answer would be based not on what was best for Cale, but on a selfish desire he barely wanted to acknowledge. He didn't want the boy to leave. The decision was forced upon them by circumstance, as such decisions often are. 3 weeks after the snakebite, On a morning when the air tasted like distant rain, a helicopter appeared in the northern sky. It circled wide, clearly searching for something, then banked toward the cabin. Jack's stomach dropped. Someone had reported them. The NOMADS camp, visible from air, must have attracted attention. Border Patrol, maybe, or BLM enforcement, checking for illegal activity on federal land. The helicopter landed 200 yards from the cabin, and two uniformed officers climbed out. They were polite but firm. This was federal land. Camping required permits. They'd need to see identification for everyone present. Jack's mind raced. Rashid, Zara, Tarek, did they have identification? Social security numbers? Any legal existence in the system? And what would happen to Cale if his parents were detained, investigated, possibly separated from him? The officers were walking closer now, radios crackling, and Jack had perhaps 30 seconds to make a choice that would change lives. He looked at Rashid, saw the fear beneath the proud facade, looked at Cale standing between his mother and father, confused, but beginning to understand that something bad was happening. Then Jack stepped forward, smile fixed, hand extended in greeting, and began the lie that would entangle all of them in consequences none could yet foresee. "Morning, officers," he said cheerfully. "These are my friends. They're helping me with some work on the property. Is there a problem?" The lie bought them time but solved nothing. The officers, young, professional, more concerned with protocol than malice, accepted Jack's explanation with mild suspicion. They recorded his identification, made notes about the nomadic camp, and informed him that long-term habitation on this particular plot required specific permits. They had 30 days to vacate or formalize their status. As the helicopter lifted off, sending dust swirling in great clouds, Jack turned to face Rashid's anger and Zara's fear. They understood enough to know Jack had protected them somehow, but also that their invisible existence had been compromised. That night, around their fire, a decision crystallized. They had to move on, disappear deeper into the desert, to places even more remote. And they had to take Cale with them. Unless. Zara spoke the unless first, her broken English thick with emotion. "You stay. You teach. You learn both ways, ours, yours. Then choose." The idea hung in the air like smoke. Rashid's face was thunderous, but beneath the anger Jack saw something else. Hope. Terrible, desperate hope. Tarek remained neutral, waiting. And Cale, understanding only that some decision about his future was being made, looked at Jack with those mismatched eyes and asked, "I stay?" Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. What Zara proposed was enormous, raising another man's child, becoming responsible for a boy caught between two worlds. It meant staying in the desert indefinitely, abandoning his own plans for solitude and simplicity. It meant opening himself to love, to vulnerability, to the possibility of failing yet another child. It meant everything he'd run from, and yet, he looked at Cale and saw Emma at that age, bright and curious and deserving of every chance life could offer. He saw a boy whose potential was being limited not by lack of intelligence, but by circumstances of birth and tradition. He saw, perhaps most clearly, a purpose he'd thought lost forever. "He can stay," Jack heard himself say, "for now, as long as everyone agrees, as long as Cale wants to." The words, once spoken, felt both terrifying and exactly right. Rashid stood abruptly, walking away into the darkness. Zara wept silently, her shoulders shaking. Tarek gripped Jack's shoulder, the second man to do so, the gesture now familiar, and said, "You good man. Hard thing." "Thank you." They spent 3 days arranging the details, or as much as could be arranged when everything was built on improvisation and trust. The nomads would travel their circuits, north in summer, south in winter, but would return every few months to check on Cale, to reinforce their teachings, to ensure their son didn't forget who he was. Jack would educate the boy, expose him to modern knowledge, but also respect and preserve his heritage. Cale would learn both languages, both ways of seeing the world. When he was old enough, 14, 15, whenever he seemed ready, he would choose which path to walk, or perhaps create his own path that combined both. Rashid's anger eventually softened to resignation, then to something approaching gratitude, though he never quite looked Jack in the eye again. The morning the nomads left was harder than Jack anticipated. Zara held Cale for long minutes, whispering in their language, kissing his forehead repeatedly. Rashid gave his son the black stone Cale had once given Jack, a circle of gift and trust coming complete. Torak made Cale promise to remember the desert songs, to watch the stars, to never become too soft for the world's sharp edges. And then they were gone, figures growing smaller against the vast landscape until they disappeared entirely. Cale stood beside Jack, silent, not crying, but clearly holding back tears. "They come back?" he asked. "They'll come back," Jack promised, praying it was true. "And until then, you and me, we've got work to do." Work indeed. The first months were chaos. Cale was brilliant but completely uneducated in any formal sense. He could read the desert like a book, but couldn't read actual books. He understood weather systems intuitively, but had no concept of mathematics beyond basic counting. He was fearless physically, but overwhelmed by the simplest modern conveniences. The first time Jack's radio spoke, Cale had hidden for 20 minutes, convinced some spirit lived in the box. Jack became teacher, father figure, and student simultaneously. He taught Cale to read using books about animals and nature, subjects the boy already loved. They did math by counting stones and measuring distances across the desert. Science lessons happened while examining scorpions and explaining why the sky changed colors. And Cale, in return, taught Jack things he'd never known: how to find water by watching where birds flew at dusk, how to predict sandstorms by the smell of the air, how to move through the landscape without leaving traces. They learned from each other, two broken pieces slowly becoming something whole. But the outside world wouldn't stay away forever. 6 months into their arrangement, a social worker appeared at the cabin, a thin woman named Patricia Chun, with kind eyes and a clipboard full of questions. Someone had reported a child living in the desert with no apparent legal guardian, no school enrollment, no medical records. Patricia sat at Jack's wobbling table and asked to see documentation: birth certificate, custody papers, proof of guardianship. Jack had none of it. He tried to explain nomadic parents, temporary arrangement. The boy was thriving, but each word seemed to dig the hole deeper. Patricia watched Cale through the window, saw him climbing rocks with casual grace, then turned back to Jack with professional sympathy. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your intentions are good, but without legal documentation, this situation cannot continue. The child needs proper education, health care, legal protection. I'm going to have to report this to my supervisor." The threat was existential. Jack knew what happened to children taken into the system: foster care, institutional life. All the bright wildness in Cale crushed under bureaucratic necessity. He had 72 hours, Patricia said, to produce documentation or legal justification for Cale's presence. Otherwise, the state would intervene. That night, Jack made phone calls he'd sworn never to make. First to his ex-wife, Sarah, who listened in stunned silence as he explained the situation. "Jack," she said finally, "you can't just adopt a random child from the desert. That's not how this works. You need lawyers. You need—" She stopped. "You need help. Real help." She gave him the number of a family law attorney she knew. The lawyer, a sharp-voiced woman named Rita Gonzalez, was blunt. "What you're describing is legally complex at best, potentially criminal at worst. If the parents have no legal status, if the child has no birth certificate, we're talking about undocumented immigrants and possible child abandonment charges. This will get messy." But Rita also heard something in Jack's voice that made her pause. "Tell me why," she said. Why this boy? Why risk everything? Jack looked out at Cale sleeping peacefully in the bed they now shared, one small hand curled around the black stone from Rashid. "Because he deserves a chance," Jack said quietly. "Because I failed my own daughter by being broken, and maybe I can do right by this one. Because he's teaching me to be human again, and I can't let the system destroy what makes him special." Silence on the line. Then Rita sighed. "Okay, here's what we're gonna do. It'll be expensive, it'll take time, and I can't promise it'll work. But we're going to try." Over the following weeks, Rita worked magic with paperwork and persistence. She found precedence cases of nomadic peoples, of traditional adoptions outside the legal system, of guardianship granted in unusual circumstances. She contacted advocates for indigenous rights, arguing that Cale's people, though not officially recognized as a tribe, deserved cultural protection. She coached Jack through affidavits and interviews, built a case that he was a suitable guardian veteran property owner, capable and committed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dutch, the previous cabin owner. Rita tracked him down in his Phoenix nursing home, and the old man, once he understood the situation, provided a notarized statement that Rashid had approached him years ago, asking about the land, about whether it could be a waypoint for travelers. Dutch had allowed it, had even met Cale as an infant during one of the NOMADS passes through the area. It wasn't much, but it established a history, a pattern, a connection that predated Jack's arrival. More importantly, it suggested the NOMADS weren't merely squatters, but had had an understanding with the landowner, an understanding that Jack, as new owner, had inherited. Patricia Chun returned 3 months later, this time with a supervisor. They interviewed Cale extensively, watched how he interacted with Jack, examined the schoolwork Jack had documented lessons in reading, writing, mathematics, science, all adapted to Cale's unique learning style. Cale, coached by Jack but also speaking his own truth, told them he was happy, that Jack was teaching him important things, that he missed his family but knew they would return, that he wanted to stay. The decision came in the form of a letter 2 weeks later. Temporary guardianship granted, contingent on continued education, regular check-ins, and formal enrollment in the state's homeschool program. It wasn't adoption. Rashid and Zara retained parental rights, should they ever claim them legally, but it was permission to continue. Jack read the letter 3 times, disbelieving, then showed it to Cale. The boy looked at the official paper with its stamps and signatures and asked, "This means I stay?" "This means you stay," Jack confirmed. Cale whooped and ran outside, spinning in circles under the desert sun, and Jack followed him out, laughing for the first time in longer than he could remember. They'd won, at least for now. But Jack understood the victory was fragile, dependent on the NOMADS remaining invisible, on Cale continuing to thrive, on 100 things outside his control. The desert had given him this gift, but the desert was capricious. Nothing here was permanent. Everything could be scoured away by the next storm. For now, though, they had time. Time to learn, to grow, to become whatever they were becoming, not father and son, not quite, but something new. A cowboy running from his past, and a boy caught between 2 worlds, making their own path through the sand. 2 years transformed them both. Cale grew taller, his lean frame adding muscle from the physical work of desert life and the exercises Jack taught him. His English became fluent, though accented with the music of his first language, and he devoured books with the hunger of someone discovering infinite worlds between covers. He tested at grade levels far beyond his age in natural sciences and spatial reasoning, though he struggled with abstract mathematics and formal grammar. Jack, for his part, softened. The hard edges grief and war had carved into him smoothed under the daily routine of caring for another person. He smiled more, slept better. The nightmares that had plagued him grew infrequent, replaced by dreams of teaching Cale to drive or watching him graduate from school futures he'd once thought impossible. True to their word, Rashid and Zara returned every 4 months, their visits timed to seasons only they fully understood. Each reunion was bittersweet. Cale would revert to his first language, help with camp duties, absorb lessons about tracking and survival that Jack couldn't teach. Rashid remained formal with Jack, their relationship built on respect rather than warmth, but Zara had softened. She'd learned more English, asked questions about Cale's education, even thanked Jack directly once, her hand on his arm, tears in her eyes. Tarek had moved on to another group, they explained, but sent greetings and a knife he'd crafted for Cale. The boy now existed genuinely in both worlds, fluent in both languages, comfortable in traditions separated by centuries of development. He was becoming exactly what the old prophecy had predicted: a bridge. The bridges are tested by what crosses them, and the test came in the form of Emma. Jack's daughter, now 14, called one evening using the number her mother must have provided. Her voice was older, uncertain. "Dad, Mom said you were different now. Better. I was wondering if maybe I could visit?" The request stunned Jack into silence. He and Emma had barely spoken in 3 years, their relationship wounded by his post-war anger and her mother's justified decision to leave. Now she wanted to visit? "I don't know, honey," he said carefully. "I'm living pretty rough out here. It's not like a regular house. And there's—" he paused. How to explain Cale? "There's someone else here, a boy I'm looking after. It's complicated." "I don't care about complicated," Emma said, and he heard his own stubbornness in her tone. "I want to see where you are. Mom says you're happy now. I want to see what happy looks like on you." How could he refuse that? Sarah drove Emma out 2 weeks later, her expensive SUV looking absurd on the dirt track leading to the cabin. She stayed only long enough to verify Jack wasn't living in complete squalor, to meet Cale with raised eyebrows and carefully neutral expression, and to tell Jack privately, "She needs this, needs to know you're okay. Don't screw it up." Then she was gone, leaving Jack alone with 2 children who had every reason to be awkward with each other and with him. The first day was torture. Emma was polite but distant, overwhelmed by the desert's emptiness and the cabin's primitive conditions. Cale was shy, uncertain how to act around this girl from his guardian's past. Jack tried too hard, talking too much, suggesting activities no one wanted to do. They ate dinner in near silence, the clink of forks unnaturally loud. That night, Jack lay awake wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake, if Emma seeing him here with Cale would only confirm her worst fears about her father. But children are resilient in ways adults forget. The next morning, Emma woke before Jack and found Cale already outside, watching the sunrise. She sat beside him without speaking, and they stayed that way until Cale pointed out a hawk riding thermals in the distance. "Golden eagle," he said, "not hawk. See the way it holds its wings?" Emma looked, saw, and asked questions. Cale answered, pleased to share his knowledge. By the time Jack emerged, they were laughing about something, and the tension had cracked. Over the following week, Emma discovered the desert through Cale's eyes. He showed her where to find interesting rocks, how to identify animal tracks, the best places to watch stars. She taught him about music playing songs from her phone that made him dance with unself-conscious joy and about the city life he'd only read about in books. They developed a sibling-like dynamic, teasing and supporting in equal measure. And Jack watched it all with a heart so full he sometimes had to walk away to compose himself. This was what family could look like. Not perfect, not conventional, but real and good and built on daily choice rather than obligation. On Emma's last evening, they built a fire outside and sat under the vast sweep of stars. Emma leaned against Jack's shoulder, something she hadn't done since she was small. "I get it now," she said quietly. Why you're here. Why you stayed. She looked at Cale, who was teaching them constellations he'd learned from Rashid. He needed you. And maybe you needed him too. Jack couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just held her closer. But peace in the desert, like everywhere, is temporary. A month after Emma left, promising to return in summer, a truck appeared on the horizon, not heading for the cabin, but toward the area where the nomads typically camped. Jack felt unease immediately. Rashid and Zara weren't due for another 6 weeks. Cale felt it too, dropping the book he'd been reading and standing to watch. The truck stopped in the distance. Men got out, 3 of them, wearing casual clothes but moving with purpose. They spread out, began walking the area, clearly searching for something, or someone. Inside, Jack told Cale. Now. He grabbed his binoculars and watched from the window. The men were taking photographs, collecting samples of something from the ground. One spoke into a satellite phone. They were there for 2 hours, then left. But Jack's gut said this wasn't over. He spent the evening trying to reach Rita Gonzalez, finally getting through after midnight. Jack, I need you to listen carefully, she said, her voice tense. There's been inquiries. Federal inquiries. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has been asking questions about nomadic groups in your area. Someone I don't know who has flagged Cale's guardianship case as potentially involving undocumented immigrants. If they find Rashid and Zara, she didn't need to finish. If ICE found the nomads, they'd be detained, possibly deported, though to where was unclear. And Cale, as their son, would be caught in the bureaucratic machinery that destroyed families in the name of order. Jack's guardianship, still temporary, still contingent, might not survive official scrutiny of his ward's parents. Everything they built could collapse in a single enforcement action. What do I do? Jack asked. You warn them, Rita said. If you have any way to contact them, you warn them to stay away until this blows over. And you pray ICE doesn't push hard enough to find what they're looking for. Jack tried. He drove to the places Rashid had described, left markers in the way Cale had taught him, stones arranged in patterns that meant danger. Stay away. But the desert is vast, and the nomads knew how to be invisible. There was no guarantee they'd see the warnings before it was too late. Days passed in anxious waiting. Cale sensed something was wrong. Asked questions Jack couldn't fully answer. Are my parents in danger? The boy asked finally, direct as always. Jack couldn't lie. Maybe. People are looking for them. People who don't understand why they live the way they do. Cale's face hardened. Because they think our way is wrong. Some people think anything different from their way is wrong, Jack said. That's not wisdom. That's fear. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday morning, announced by the sound of helicopters, 2 of them this time, and vehicles coming up the road. Jack had perhaps 5 minutes before they arrived. He pulled Cale close, spoke fast. Listen to me. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, remember this. You belong here. With me, with your parents, in both worlds. Don't let anyone tell you different. Don't let anyone tell you different. Don't let them make you choose what you're not ready to choose. And if they try to take you away, you fight. You hear me? You use everything I've taught you and everything your father taught you, and you fight. Cale nodded, terrified but trusting. Then the officials were at the door, ICE agents this time, with Patricia Chun looking distressed behind them. They had questions, demands to see documentation, implied threats about harboring undocumented persons. Jack stood his ground, cited the guardianship order, refused to let them interview Cale without Rita present. It became a standoff, tense and ugly, with Cale pressed against Jack's side and officials arguing into radios. Then, cutting through the chaos, came a voice Jack had never expected to hear again. Excuse me, gentlemen, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding. It was Dutch. The old man stood beside Patricia Chun, leaning on a cane, his voice reedy but firm. I'm the previous owner of this property, and I have documents proving that the family in question has had permission to transit this land for over 20 years. They're not illegal immigrants. They're the descendants of indigenous travelers with ancestral claims predating modern borders. I've brought historical records, anthropological research, and a letter from a senator's office requesting your investigation be conducted with appropriate cultural sensitivity. It was magnificent bullshit, delivered with absolute conviction. Dutch winked at Jack when the agents weren't looking. The officials were thrown off balance, uncertain. An indigenous claim, even a dubious one, meant lawyers, delays, public relations nightmares. The lead agent made a call, argued with someone, then reluctantly agreed to continue the investigation through proper channels, which meant Jack understood that they were backing off, at least for now. As the helicopters lifted away and the vehicles retreated, Jack stood with an arm around Cale and another hand gripping Dutch's shoulder. "How?" he asked simply. Dutch smiled. "Your lawyer called me. Explained the situation. I've been doing research, found some interesting historical connections. Turns out those nomads aren't just wandering randomly. Their route follows old trade paths, sacred sites, water sources used by indigenous people centuries ago. Whether that gives them legal standing is debatable, but it gives them a story. And stories, told right, have power." He looked at Cale kindly. "You're a lucky boy to have so many people willing to fight for you. Don't waste that gift." That evening, as the desert painted itself in sunset colors, Rashid and Zara appeared on the horizon. Jack's warnings had reached them, and they'd come despite the risk, drawn by the same instinct that brings parents running when their children are threatened. The reunion was emotional. Cale flew into his mother's arms, while Rashid gripped Jack's hand. Hard, his eyes saying everything his mouth couldn't. They sat together that night, 5 people under the stars, and talked about the future. It couldn't continue like this, Rita had explained in a follow-up call. The attention was too much. They needed something more permanent, more legal, more protected. Rashid and Zara faced a choice: formalize their existence in the system, which meant the end of their nomadic life, or disappear completely, which meant leaving Cale behind. The choice was impossible, which meant it was also inevitable. In the end, Zara spoke what they'd all been thinking. He chooses. Cale chooses. He is bridge, must decide which side to stand on, or whether to stand in middle. Cale, 11 years old, but somehow older, looked at each adult in turn, then spoke in English so everyone would understand. "I don't want to choose. I want both. Is that wrong?" "No," Jack said quietly. "That's not wrong. That's exactly right. You shouldn't have to choose between your parents or between 2 ways of being human. We re the ones who are wrong for making the world so narrow that bridges don't fit." He looked at Rashid and Zara. What if they stayed? What if you formalized just enough to be legal, not giving up who you are, but making space in the system for people like you? Rita thinks she can help with that. Find indigenous classification, or cultural protection, or something. It won't be easy, and it won't be perfect. But maybe Cale could have both families, both worlds. The nomads exchanged a long look, a whole conversation happening in silence. Then Rashid nodded slowly. "We try," he said in careful English. "For son, we try. It wouldn't be simple." The following months involved paperwork, interviews, compromises that felt like betrayals of tradition, but were necessary for survival in the modern age. Rashid and Zara established legal identities, claimed indigenous heritage that was complicated but arguably true, agreed to register Cale officially, and split his custody between Jack and them. They couldn't wander as freely as before, but they found ways to maintain their connection to the desert, to their traditions, to the life that had shaped them. And Cale, remarkable Cale, learned to navigate it all, spending school months with Jack, summer months traveling with his parents, becoming truly what the prophecy had predicted. Jack watched the boy grow and knew he'd been given something rare, a second chance, a purpose, a family he'd built rather than inherited. The desert had broken him down and rebuilt him into someone capable of love again. Emma visited regularly now, sometimes bringing friends who wanted to experience the desert's strange magic. Dutch became a regular presence, his historical research turning into a book about indigenous nomadic peoples of the Southwest. Rita sent updates, usually accompanied by exasperated notes about how Jack's case was the most complicated and oddly beautiful she'd ever handled. And on quiet evenings, when Cale was studying by lantern light and the desert wind sang its ancient songs, Jack would sit outside with his coffee and marvel at the unlikely path that had led him here. He'd bought a cabin to escape society, to hide from his failures, to disappear. Instead, he'd found a boy raised by nomads, a culture on the edge of extinction, a battle worth fighting, and a reason to wake up each morning grateful. The desert had taught him its greatest lesson. You don't escape your life by running away. You transform it by running towards something worth the risk. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, what you run toward runs toward you too. Meeting in the middle? Two strangers becoming family under the vast and different sky that witnesses all human hope and calls it good.